I'm joined today by Frank Schaeffer, who is a writer and author of Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God. Frank is also both a survivor of polio and a fundamentalist evangelical childhood. And that's even an understatement, Frank. I mean, your parents essentially created what do you call it, a Christian sect, a community?
Hey, a little bit of all of the above. You know, I guess people who aren't familiar with evangelical work don't understand that evangelicalism may not have a pope, it has many popes. And my father became one of those, a very famous evangelical in American and British evangelical circles in the 70s and 80s. And so I wouldn't so much say it was a cult, but it was certainly a sect of personality or a cult of personality. So people who followed my dad and my mom's writings, for instance, were, the kind of folks who would buy everything he wrote, who would show up at any lecture he gave, who would write for the most personal kind of advice, and, followed him much in a way that we associate, say, with, when the Beatles went off to India and were sitting at the feet of the Maharishi, and for a while all their records reflected sitar music and the rest of it. It was kind of like that. I mean, this was the 60s when my dad got well known, and the people beating a path to his door at Le Brie Fellowship in Switzerland, where he had his ministry, were, hitchhiking students. They came out of the Beat generation first, and then hippies and others. So my dad really was an evangelical, but an evangelical cast in the mold of a kind of a hippie guru in the late 50s, 60s into the early 70s.
Yeah, because when I was reading about it, it seemed like there were elements at Le Brie of kind of a retreat type situation, of a commune, but we're also talking about pretty fundamentalist Christian ideology, which it's not always prevalent in commune type places.
Well, my dad was an evangelical, but with a twist. So what's odd is one of the things I say in my book that I've written recently, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, is that I'm sort of thankful for his blessed hypocrisy. And I don't mean that as a put down. My mom and dad were better than their theology. So if you had come to the community, say, in 1970 or 1969, you would have found a place that was open to gay people to come, that had a lot of racial diversity, where people were camping out on the balconies in sleeping bags. Lectures on art or Bob Dylan's lyrics would have been normal in the chapel. But if you had asked a theological question about the Bible, whether my dad really believed every word of it was true, what was called the inerrancy of Scripture, or a little later in the early 70s, the social issues like abortion, for instance, you would have gotten a stock fundamentalist answer, not that different than you would have gotten, say, from Jerry Falwell, another founder of the religious right. So Dad lived a kind of a split existence, a split personality. His own community in Switzerland was very open and wonderful. Whether you agreed with the theology and philosophy is a different point, but in terms of the vibe of the place. But when it came to the theology, it fed right back into American evangelical mainstream, which then turned into the religious right, of which my family was very much of a part.
And as you grew up in this context, did you at a certain point, I read somewhere that you actually were kind of trying to convince your father to take even more bold stands on some of the social issues like abortion. So did you see your future kind of in this ideology?
Oh, yeah. I mean, listen, I was a fiery, young, evangelical, conservative, cast in the mold of a lot of the guys who went on and formed things like Operation Rescue and these other groups that even turned violent in the end. And this is, back in the early 70s. And of course, I'm a very different person now. But had I not gotten out of the religious right, if I may say so myself, I would be a lot richer than I am right now. There was good money in them thar God hills, so to speak, that I was steadily mining.
You were kind of becoming known in a way as kind of like a Christian speaker. I don't know that I'm exaggerating when I say that.
No, not at all. I mean, look, you can't talk about Christian evangelical mainstream much more than saying that I filled in for my dad one year when he was at Mayo Clinic getting cancer treatment. and gave the keynote address at the Southern Baptist Convention to 23,000 pastors. And I also gave a keynote address at the religious broadcasters to 6,000 or 7,000 religious broadcasters, by the way, the same year that Ronald Reagan came and spoke there. So back in the day, the people we were keeping company with, like Jack Kemp, who then became Bob Dole's running mate for a presidential election, or Gerald Ford, whose son Mike was at L'Abri studying when my daughter Jessica was born, after I got my teenage girlfriend pregnant when we were 17 and 18. And had a child there in the community. Later got married, and by the way, 45 years we're still together, and I have 3 grown kids and 5 grandchildren, which also, by the way, figures into the book. I use a lot of examples from just being with my grandchildren and how I've changed and learned, and the difference between me as a Calvinist young teenage father who thought I was supposed to be head of the home and in charge of everything, and where I'm at today. But that said, yeah, for a while, I was sloshing around with these guys. I mean, hey, Jerry Falwell lent me his jet, and I flew around to a number of venues where we were speaking in his private jet. So we were in the middle of everything, not on the edge of it. The difference, if I just may throw something in here that I've written about, was that, when we were knocking on the door of people like President Reagan and the first George Bush and Ford and these other guys, or staying with Jack Kemp in his home, doing lectures for those guys in the Republican Party. We were outsiders knocking on the door. We were right-wing evangelical agitators. The difference between now and then is now both houses of Congress are being run by a Republican Party that was taken over by people like us, who are no longer outsiders. They are actually sitting in Congress doing things like shutting down the government to obstruct Barack Obama, trying to rescind health care because of the big bad government. So that kind of hatred and suspicion and victimology that we brought from our evangelical world into our activism as outsiders when we were trying to convince ordinary politicians like Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, no matter what you think of him, was not a crazy right-wing fundamentalist Christian.
Right.
He was very much a pragmatist. Now, we're on the inside, or people like us are on the inside running the show. So, the idiots have taken over the asylum, and it's a whole new day. But you don't understand what happened then unless you understand, what happened now, unless you look back and understand what we were doing then.
I want to get into your eventual transition out, but before we even touch on that, we'll touch on that in the second part.
Yeah.
You mentioned Jerry Falwell, and I read about some of the conversations that you and your father had about the kind of association with those types. In
Right.
your experience with the Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell types,
Yeah.
are they truly sincere in their beliefs that they claim are their biblical beliefs, or do they see this first as a sort of business or way to fame and money?
Well, a little bit of all of the above. I think a lot of these guys like Jerry Falwell were on a kind of a journey. Look at this guy. He was a segregationist of the Old South who didn't think blacks and whites even ought to share the church, let alone anything else. And he moved from that position to accommodate what he saw was the trend, because he was going to lose audience and lose parishioners when that was no longer fashionable. So he was pragmatic in his own way. But when it came to people like Pat Robertson and him and Dr. Dobson, who started Focus on the Family, I know one thing for sure, because I knew all these guys well. After all, Dr. Dobson gave away 150,000 copies of an evangelical book I wrote called A Time for Anger as a fundraising fulfillment. Had me on his show 3 times, that kind of thing. Same with Pat Robertson, same with Jerry Falwell, who had me preaching from his pulpit to the whole student body one time. What I want to say is, look, wherever they started out, the fact is where they wound up was running empires. And so by the time Jerry Falwell, for instance, just to give you one example of a story that I personally knew about because I was there, somebody cut the guy wires on his transmission tower when radio wasn't digital but AM and so forth. The tower fell down. He had been picketed a couple of weeks before that by a gay group, so it was very easy for him to blame the homosexuals, as he would call it. I happened to be there speaking a few weeks later when Cal Thomas, who now is a Fox News commentator, was running the Moral Majority as his organizer. Well, Cal told me, he said, hey, I'm a little disturbed by Jerry because Even though we're doing the Lord's work here, he's raised the money to rebuild that tower 3 or 4 times. In fact, the insurance paid for it, but he's out here saying we still don't have the money. Please send us a donation so that we can combat the homosexual agenda. This was really typical of all of these people. They wherever they started, I mean, frankly, they turned into shysters and/or lunatics. And one thing for sure, and I was well on the way to this myself, so I know what I'm speaking about here. This kind of adulation from an evangelical or any believing religious public turns you into an egomaniac. I mean, you're sure you're right about everything. So I can just say point blank, if I hadn't gotten out of this whole thing in 1984 or soon after when my dad died in 84, it would have wrecked my marriage. It would have wrecked my life. It would have wrecked everything. And I certainly would have completely lost any sense of spirituality or actual faith in my life. I mean, I think the fastest road to complete loss of faith is religious stardom in most instances. I don't think anything destroys actual faith quicker than that. So, these are just some observations on the way by. And, in this book, Why I'm an Atheist Who I Believe in God, what I'm trying to do there is kind of rebuild toward some idea of mystery and faith as an alternative for this view. And what's interesting to me is I'm getting all kinds of email and Facebook messages and tweets from people who come out of similar backgrounds to mine. Not that their parents were evangelical leaders, but they come from that evangelical background. There's a huge exodus going on. And these guys are reading my book and saying in it they are finding not necessarily a roadmap, but a kind of a Me Too moment where they're saying, well, thanks for telling our story because we have drawn the same conclusions about our fundamentalist evangelical past or even maybe strict Roman Catholic or Jewish past. Thanks for giving us permission to take a look at this and embrace paradox and unknowing rather than all this kind of certainty addiction we were all into that writes off anybody that disagrees with you as wrong and divides.
Well, that's a good place to pause because I want to get next to how you became someone who decided to move away from the movement. I'll remind the audience we've been speaking with Frank Schaeffer. The book is, as he mentioned, Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God. We'll pause, and then in the conclusion to the interview, we will talk with Frank about how he eventually left the evangelical Christian community. So we're speaking with Frank Schaeffer. We've been speaking with him about the book, Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God. We've talked about how he got into evangelical Christianity through the Christian community L'Abri that his parents founded. You talked in the first part of our interview, Frank, about how you're moving away from evangelical Christianity coincided, time-wise at least, with the passing of your father. Was that the catalyst that made you revise how you were looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think people understand that only the mob, the mafia, and the British royal family share the same level of nepotistic kind of fatalism that evangelical big-time ministries have. I mean, look at Billy Graham, followed by his son Franklin, who had tried to walk away from the ministry, had a, quote, rebellious youth, and then was corralled back in again, and now he's running this multi-million-dollar outfit, paying himself $1 million plus a year, and, running a mausoleum for his parents down there in the South. Dr. Dobson, half the family on the payroll. Jerry Falwell, his son's running his college now that he started. On and on it goes. So mine was the norm, not the exception. It was like, of course you're going to follow your dad into this. This is where you can earn a living. This is what you've been raised from birth, more or less, to do. So that was it. But when Dad died, I wanted to be an artist. I mean, maybe you can see some paintings behind me on the wall. We're in my studio office here. I was interested in filmmaking. And L'Abri, that my parents were running, as I mentioned at the first part of this interview, was very different from most evangelical communities. We had arts festivals. We had poetry readings. We had serious musicians coming through. So my background was not a good fit. And when I moved to the States in 1980, as an adult with a wife and 2 children, and Jeannie was pregnant with our third, and I began to actually try to live within the evangelical subculture that we were leaders in and really looked at what it was. And I was meeting people who hated the movies I loved and hated the music I loved and didn't like my gay friends and, thought art was of the devil. It was like, holy shit, what have I stumbled into? And so I would come off the road angrier and angrier and angrier with my wife and my kids and my life and, trying to weigh up, well, then how else do I earn my living? But genuinely feeling not only am I losing my faith entirely, and becoming a kind of a flake like these guys, because I don't mean a word of it. Every rock I would turn over and find somebody like Jerry Falwell scurrying out underneath, was horrific compared to my parents'
Frank.
integrity.
So you're saying you were at a point where you were still preaching the material, but you did not believe in it.
No, I did not. And you know what? I get emails today from people who are in a similar position right now, pastors and youth workers and all this, who say, hey, if I could figure out how to earn my living, I'd leave. And they're honest with me about it. I don't know, I guess they trust me. I never publish who these guys are, but trust me, I get this mail all the time.
Yeah.
I did leave. And I'm not saying I'm better than they are. Maybe I was just more desperate and sick of it all. But I wanted to be an artist and a filmmaker. So I got out and I cut a reel from the documentaries I had made with my father, How Should We Then Live, and Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that featured my dad and Dr. C. Everett Koop, and really was the basis of the evangelical pro-life movement. And I cut out all the God bits and theology and just left the nice pans and moves and crane shots and stuff that we had dramatized, so that I had a reel. I got myself an agent. I went to Hollywood and over the next 10 years made 4 very forgettable Hollywood feature films, mostly R-rated action and horror crap. And then I wrote a novel called Portofino, and thank God got good reviews and started to really be a serious writer, and realized that, this is the way I was going to do my art, as well as doing some painting, but mainly through writing. And, that's like 15 books ago, and I've written 5 novels and 10 or so nonfiction works. And, that's sort of my story. But when I got out, I'll be honest with you, Jeannie and I were broke. And it was, oh, crap, what have we done? And I was really close a lot of times to picking up a phone and just calling someone like Pat Robertson and saying, hey, I was wrong. I've been called back into the ministry in some sort of, reconversion story just for the money. But
is that a story? If you were to have called someone like Pat Robertson, would they have been sensitive to that? Would they have accepted you back in, maybe given you a job?
Oh, yeah. I mean, hell, look, Jimmy Swaggart got back in and, he was out there screwing whores. You can always come back. They love conversion stories. Now I've really torn it. I mean, I'm 30 years in and I'm, was one of the Huffington Post first bloggers and Obama's big supporter. And, I'm done now. My goose is cooked. But when I was just doing things like writing novels like Portofino, Zermatt, and Saving Grandma, that are works of humor kind of at the expense of the evangelical community, but, not hard-hitting political commentary, I could have come back. But, hey, of course, it's all done now. However, having said that, if I've ever seen grace and God's hand in my life, it was precisely in getting out while I still had a little sanity left. And luckily being young enough in my late 20s so that I was able to make a new life. And my wife was just so relieved when we got out, and my relationship with both her and my children improved no end, because okay, I'm still a schmuck, but at least I was me, and I wasn't trying to pretend I was this other person. And
along those lines, Frank, in the last few minutes we have left, when you left, as far as your religious beliefs go, I've talked to people who have left their church, but not necessarily their religion in terms of what they believe regarding an afterlife, creation, etc. You left this specific evangelical Christian community and those beliefs, and you consider yourself, as the book says, an atheist who believes in God. What are your religious beliefs today?
Well, let's just take the title. They start with being anti-labeling. People say, how can you be both? And I say, hey, listen, I've never met an atheist or a Christian. I've only met people who are ambivalent on a journey. We change our minds. We feel differently in the morning than the afternoon sometimes. I don't put religion in a special category of truth. I put it in the same category I put relationships, art, politics, everything else. And how do relationships go? Well, I could say I'm a married man who loves my wife and sometimes hates her after a huge fight and we haven't reconciled and we're angry and somebody walks out. There's never a one-size-fits-all label to cover the big moments of life. So what do I believe these days? Precisely what the title says. And that is that I'm a person of faith in the sense that I believe that there is a spiritual dynamic in my life, as I put it in the book, an offstage chorus, as it were, in an opera that you hear out there somewhere. But on the other hand, I am a straight-up secular believer in science and evolution and genetics and all the rest of it. So I don't try to reconcile these things. I simply embrace the paradox based on the fact that we're semi-evolved primates at the beginning of an evolutionary process. So why are we making all these vast cosmological statements and sticking people with labels?
Well, now, when you say you believe in God, if we imagine kind of a spectrum of what that could mean, it could mean, right, I believe that that Jesus is the literal Son of God, and there's a kind of personal God in heaven that you meet when you die. And then kind of on the other end would be God as a kind of analogy for there are forces at play that we don't yet understand, and who knows what the meaning is of those. So
well, I'd go further than saying don't yet understand. I would just say, hey, listen, we're never going to understand them.
We don't know that, right?
Well, hey, I was watching Kubrick's 2001 last night, and it's great, but he thought by 2001 we'd be having missions to the far reaches of the universe. Obviously, that didn't happen. We're lucky to get a probe landed somewhere. So I just think, let's back off for a minute and talk about these issues more like we're just having a couple of beers amongst friends. And on that level, I think very few of us, especially the older you get, know very much. So my idea of God is exactly what you just said, and that is this kind of unknown force, what the Orthodox Church and the Eastern mystical tradition calls apophatic theology, which is a theology of not knowing. And so, that's kind of where I am. Now, do I believe all the time? No, of course I don't. But why do I go to a Greek Orthodox church? Because I enjoy the ritual. I like community. I like giving some substance of practice and rites to contemplative moments in my life. And to be honest, I was raised with religion, so I feel comfortable with it. I don't pretend I have the truth or something like that. I just say, hey, this is me. These two things coexist in my life. Hey, that's how I am. What are you like? What's somebody else like? It's not a truth statement versus falsehood. It's just I try to be honest in the book and just say, hey, this is where I'm coming from.
Drastically different than that traditional, what we now see as the evangelical Christian perspective on truth.
Yeah, which is, hey, if you don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, you're going to burn in hell forever. Right. Well, hey, you know what? Not only do I not come from that, just dealing with my own little grandchildren, Lucy, Jack, and Nora, ages 6, 4, and 9 months, that Jeannie and I happen to take care of every day while their parents work. There's nothing these kids could ever do to me or get my name wrong or my birthday or believe the wrong thing or think I had 6 arms that's going to make me burn them forever. So one thing I know for sure, and you can take this to the bank, speaking of unknowing, I kind of know this one. If there is any creative force out there that in some way seeded our evolutionary process with the ability to develop consciousness and empathy, and a guy like me has enough empathy to not want to burn anybody to death forever, again and again and again, let alone his own children, I just don't buy it. So the evangelical theology of damnation is a crock, and it's a crock just based on what we know as human, very imperfect, semi-evolved creatures. So let's stop thinking about a creator that's stupider than we are.
Absolutely. We've been speaking with Frank Schaeffer. I'll remind the audience that the book is Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God. Frank, very interesting story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Hey.